Hello, I'm Martin, and welcome to Short Stories, brought to you by the National Taichung University of Science and Technology Language Center. Today's short story is called The Gnome. It's one of the Grimm brothers' fairy tales. It's about a young man who uses his wits to save a princess. There are actually many very similar fairy tales from all over Europe. The details can vary quite a bit from region to region. And today you will hear my interpretation of the story. Before I begin the story, I will read the vocabulary and example sentences. I will finish by asking you 4 listening comprehension questions. Time to start. Vocabulary. Get away with. Get away with. Many people would not pay their taxes if they thought they could get away with it. Distraught. Distraught. The parents were distraught because their child was missing. Deserted. Deserted. No one has lived in this deserted house for many years. Regenerate. Regenerate. A lizard can regenerate its tail in 60 days. Munch. Munch. I saw him munching on an apple. Demeanor. Demeanor. Outwardly, her demeanor didn't appear to be unhappy at all. Brush off. Brush off. I smiled at her, but she just brushed me off. Run into. Run into. Because our plan was so bad, we ran into trouble. Now the story. Once upon a time there lived a king and his 3 beautiful but stupid daughters. The king was very fond of plants, so he had the most fantastic botanical garden in the country. He collected seeds from the 4 corners of his kingdom. One was very special. It was a magical apple tree that was given to him by a wizard. According to the wizard, only the king could eat the apples from this tree. If anyone else tried to eat the apples, they would be sucked into the ground. The king's daughters were playing in the garden one day. The youngest was looking at the beautiful red apples of the magic tree and said, "I wonder what they taste like." The oldest said, "Don't even think about it. You heard what Dad said." But the youngest daughter was too curious for her own good. She took an apple and ate a bite. She then offered it to her middle sister, saying, "This is the most delicious apple I have ever tasted. You've got to try it." The middle sister took a bite. When the oldest sister saw that they weren't sucked into the ground, she decided to take a bite too. What the sisters did not know is that magic can be tricky. Just when you think you have gotten away with something, that's when it kicks in. Right after the oldest sister took a bite, the ground opened up and swallowed the 3 sisters. The king was distraught. He did not know what to do. He ordered his servants to dig at the spot where his daughters had disappeared, but they could find nothing but dirt and rock. The king then came up with an idea. He recruited 3 hunters to go to the wizard's castle to look for clues. "Maybe they are trapped there," he said. The hunters set off on their quest right away and arrived at the castle 8 days later. When they arrived, they noticed that it was deserted. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. So they were surprised to find a table full of freshly made food. "It's still warm," said the oldest and strongest hunter. "Let's eat, I'm starving," said the middle hunter. The youngest and smallest hunter stopped him and said, "No, don't. This is a wizard's castle. It must be some kind of trick." So the three hunters sat and waited for the wizard to return. Eventually, they couldn't take it any longer, and they ate the delicious food. "See, I told you it was safe," said the middle hunter to the youngest hunter. "You're such an idiot," said the oldest hunter as he stuffed mozzarella sticks into his mouth. To their surprise, the food regenerated during the night, so they decided to make the castle their base of operations. They set up camp in the dining hall and planned their search of the area. They drew lots to decide who would stay behind and watch over their stuff while the other two searched for the princesses. The oldest hunter drew the shortest stick and stayed in the castle. While the other two were out, the oldest hunter munched on some bread. He heard a noise and looked over his shoulder. A little gnome appeared and walked up to him. "May I have some bread, please?" the gnome asked in a squeaky voice. The hunter was a little annoyed by this, but he cut a small piece of bread for the gnome anyway. When he handed it to the gnome, the little creature dropped it and said, "Oh my, I have dropped my piece of bread. Could you pick it up for me, please?" The hunter grumbled and bent down to pick up the piece of bread. When he did so, the gnome suddenly changed demeanor and viciously attacked him. The hunter screamed in pain as the gnome punched his face. It then disappeared as mysteriously as it appeared. The next day was the middle hunter's turn to stay behind. The oldest hunter warned him not to give any bread to the gnome. While the two other hunters were away, the gnome appeared again. This time it asked for a cup of water. "I'm so thirsty. My little lips are so dry," the creature said. The middle hunter thought, "I definitely won't give it any bread. But what harm could a little water do?" As soon as the hunter bent down to hand the cup to the gnome, he was attacked. The gnome beat him as savagely as he beat the last hunter. The third day came, and it was the youngest hunter's turn. His name was Ralph. He was much smaller than the other two. They would make fun of him and call him names. "Look at stupid Ralph. His arms are so weak. He'll never be as manly as me," said the oldest hunter as he flexed his muscles. Ralph brushed off their insults. He was focused on finding the princesses. While the two older hunters were out searching, Ralph stood at the door to the dining hall. The gnome appeared and asked Ralph for a piece of bread. The gnome dropped it and asked Ralph to pick it up for him. Ralph replied sharply, "Get it yourself." The gnome grew angry and said, "If you don't pick up that bread, I'll beat you to death." Before the gnome could attack, Ralph kicked him across the room like a football. "Ouch!" cried the gnome. Ralph was just about to kick the gnome again when it said, "Please stop. Don't hurt me anymore. I'll tell you what you want. I know you are looking for the princesses. I can help you." Ralph was suspicious. "What do you know about the princesses?" he asked. The gnome then explained that the magical tree was connected to the gnome's village under the castle, and that the princesses were at the bottom of a very deep, dry well. Then the gnome warned him, "Don't trust those other two hunters. They are fools who plan to betray you." The little gnome reached inside his shirt pocket and pulled out a flute. "Take this. If you need help, just call us." Suddenly, the gnome disappeared, leaving Ralph alone with a lot to think about. When the other two hunters returned, Ralph told them about the well, and the three planned to go there the next day. Their plan was to lower two hunters down the well with a bell. If they ran into trouble, they were to ring the bell, and the hunter at the surface would quickly pull them up. The three hunters looked down the well. It was very dark and spooky. "It looks pretty scary," said Ralph. "Maybe to a wimp like you, I'll go first," announced the oldest hunter. They lowered him down the well with a rope. However, he hadn't gotten halfway down the well when he panicked and started ringing the bell. "Help! My arms are cramping! I can't hold the rope much longer!" shouted the oldest hunter. They pulled him up, and the middle hunter decided to go next. "Watch how a brave man does it," he said. But he too couldn't make it down the well. "Help! Something touched my leg! I think it was a spider!" he yelled. Now it was Ralph's turn. They lowered him all the way down the well. When he got to the bottom, he found 3 large doors. Behind the first door, he found the oldest princess, who was guarded by a dragon with 4 heads. Behind the second door, he found the middle princess, who was guarded by a dragon with 5 heads. And behind the third door, he found the youngest princess, guarded by a dragon with 9 heads. Fortunately for Ralph, the dragons were all sleeping. With a little help from the princesses, cutting off their heads was easy. The princesses were so thankful that they hugged and kissed him. The youngest princess was especially grateful and gave him the most passionate kiss. Ralph blushed and escorted the princesses to the rope. One by one, they were lifted to the surface. Finally, it was Ralph's turn, but he remembered the gnome's warning. Instead of tying the rope to himself, he tied it to a large rock. When the rock was halfway up the well, the 2 treacherous hunters let go of the rope and let it fall. The gnome was right. The 2 foolish hunters planned to kill him. Ralph was now stuck at the bottom of the well. He remembered the flute that the gnome had given him. He pulled it out and played a note, and in no time, the cave was filled with little gnomes. They formed a ladder and helped Ralph out of the well. The 2 foolish hunters were now back at the king's castle with the princesses. They claimed that they alone had saved them and that Ralph had died of fright. The king was just about to grant them their reward when Ralph suddenly arrived. "They're lying to you, your highness," exclaimed Ralph, "and I can prove it." He pulled a dragon's head from his bag and showed it to the king. The oldest hunter yelled, "You can't believe this moron! How could such a wuss kill a dragon?" Just then, the youngest princess, who had been listening from another room, burst in. She said, "No, Ralph is telling the truth. These 2 brutes grabbed us and threatened to kill us if we talked. They are the real cowards." The king believed his daughter and ordered the 2 hunters to be thrown down the well. As for Ralph, he married the youngest princess and was rewarded with one of the king's estates. They lived happily ever after. Questions. Number 1. Who could eat the apples from the magic tree? A. Anyone. B. Only the king's daughters. C. Only the king. D. Ralph. The answer is C. Only the king. Question 2. What did the 2 older hunters think of Ralph? A. They liked him. B. They didn't like him. C. They were afraid of him. D. They didn't know Ralph. The answer is B. They did not like him. Question 3. Who saved the princesses? A. Ralph. B. The gnome. C. The 3 hunters together. D. The king. The answer is A. Ralph. Question 4. What is the lesson of this story? A. Never give bread to a gnome. B. Don't judge a book by its cover. C. Gardens are a good place to have a picnic. D. Don't play in old wells. The answer is B. Don't judge a book by its cover. If you remember the story, the youngest hunter, named Ralph, was always being made fun of by the older hunters. They made fun of the way he looked. They said he was short and had weak arms and was not manly, so they made fun of him. But Ralph was actually the bravest and most manly of the three. So don't judge a book by its cover. Well, that's the end of today's short story. It's a story filled with Western symbolism and metaphors, the most powerful of which is the symbolism of the girl eating the apple. Maybe some of you have heard the story of Adam and Eve. Well, it's a common thing that comes up in Western stories a lot. So, just a reminder to my female students, never eat an apple that is not yours. All right, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.